This is the China Hollywood Greenlight Podcast, episode number 16.
And rolling sound. Quiet.
Here we go. Ready.
Speeding. 120, take 7.
And action.
This is Caryn McCann, the host of the China Hollywood Greenlight Podcast, a podcast about creating and distributing content for both Hollywood and China. If you like the show, please go to iTunes and leave a rating so other people can find this podcast. These reviews really do help spread the word. Before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to start out with a motivational quote to encourage our listeners to continue on their path to achieving their own green light. And today's quote comes from Mark Twain, who said, 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did do. So throw off the bowlines, sail away from safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails. Explore, dream, discover. And now a few words about what I'm working on. I have 4 items to share with you. Number 1, I got a call from a Chinese financier who wants to finance 2 of my films and turn one into a TV series. However, right now we're just talking, so I'm not breaking out the champagne just yet. But it's a nice compliment, so I'm grateful for that. But I'll keep pitching and plugging away. Number 2, this Chinese financier said he prefers I bring in an American director and not a Chinese director. At first, I thought this was odd, but I'm open-minded. So now I am shortlisting American directors. Number 3, one of my proposals has been translated into Chinese, and I'll start sending that out next week. And number 4, I'm working on a new script and got the outline done. I should finish a draft of Act 1 by Monday. And now for the main segment. Today, I spoke with filmmaker and media producer Jeffrey G. Chin. Here is the interview. Today's guest is filmmaker and media producer Jeffrey G. Chin. Jeffrey grew up in Marin County and is an honors graduate of UC Berkeley's Film Studies and has an MFA from USC School of Cinematic Arts. His mission is to share the untold stories of immigrant pioneers who came to the U.S. in the early 20th century. In 2005, Jeffrey traveled to China with the Chinese Cultural Center of San Francisco's In Search of Roots program. 11 Chinese Americans were chosen to visit their ancestral villages in Guangdong province. Jeffrey produced a documentary on the journey. Excerpts were screened on ABC's Good Morning America. Currently, Jeffrey is developing several long-form projects and assists and second unit directs for acclaimed director John Singleton on commercials and television shows such as Billions, which is on Showtime, and Snowfall, which is on FX. Jeffrey also received a fellowship from the Aurora Foundation, where he will be conducting research on early immigration patterns in Western Japan in preparation for his feature film. Well, Jeffrey, thank you for coming on the show today.
Hi, Caryn. Well, thank you so much for having me.
I've told the audience just a little bit about you, but why don't you take a minute and tell us more about yourself and your business?
Yeah, well, this whole filmmaking aspect of my life has been a long time coming. I actually grew up in Marin County as one of the only Asian kids in the area, and I was introduced to filmmaking at a pretty young age, sort of being exposed to movies like Jurassic Park, where I got to see someone like Spielberg recreate a world that we wouldn't have seen before.
Right.
And when I was only in high school, my grandfather had passed away, and that was a big deal to me because he was sort of the anchor of our family with our cultural identities and representation. And so part of me realized that as much as big Hollywood blockbusters are very appealing and I love them, I wanted to find a way to also give back in a more thoughtful manner that could create content that would last for generations to come.
Wow.
So I started to do work with documentaries, telling stories of early Chinese immigrants in the Bay Area, then working through Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. And that's sort of where my career started.
Okay, great. Now, my first question is, I kind of ask the same question of everyone. Obviously, you're Chinese American, but why do you want to work in the China market now?
I think I've always wanted to work with the China market. It's sort of been a learning curve for myself because I'm actually about 3 or 4 generations Chinese American. And it wasn't until 2005 that I traveled back to China And most of my family hasn't even visited our ancestral villages there. So it's a place that, has been decades since the last family member had went there. And so something that I always took pride in was that we would watch, a lot of the classic Chinese and Hong Kong action films growing up, and it was really cool. But I never knew how I could participate in that world. And I know that nowadays, since our international market has been expanding quite a bit,
Right.
We have opportunities not only to do, of course, those wonderful, but tell stories about the Chinese diaspora across the globe.
Okay, well, you are a filmmaker. You make documentaries. You make television. You make narrative features, TV. I know no day is typical, quote unquote, but tell us, what are 2 or 3 main tasks you do on a, quote, typical day?
Also, currently we're working on Snowfall on FX, and so I'm the assistant to John Singleton there. And so we usually go through our different screenplays as we're developing them. The Snowfall series is specifically about the crack cocaine epidemic in 1980s Los Angeles. And we talk about cultural nuances, ways to enhance the story. And then we usually go to set and work with the directors and sort of, keep John's vision intact. And so it's a really wonderful experience for me because I didn't grow up with too many Black role models. And so working with John is just a fantastic opportunity because, as we know, we have minimal representation of Asian faces in the broader scope of world cinema. And I think that, now is the time that we can really celebrate them.
So are you second unit directing on that one, or what exactly are you doing on that one?
So second unit directed on Billions, and I'm assisting John on Snowfall. And so specifically, when we get to his finale episode, which will be in a few weeks, we'll be working with him to, go through the script, scout the locations, write notes and beats of how we want the sequences to work. And so I get to be his right-hand man in that way, and I'm learning quite a bit during the process.
Are you writing as well, or mainly just on the camera side?
Not writing for this TV show. I have my own projects that I've been developing.
Okay.
Specifically talking about the early Japanese-American experience and the Chinese-American experience. So those have been projects pretty close to my heart over the past decade or so. Yeah.
Now you're working on this very big TV show with John Singleton for FX. How do you find these jobs? How do you find, for example, business partners or future business partners? And how do you suggest the audience find and for this podcast, we're interested in Chinese business partners?
Mm-hmm. Well, on Snowfall, I think mostly it's a lot of the partners have gone through FX and the larger Fox networks, which is now under Disney. So those are usually vetted through the studio system. But how I was introduced to John was actually during my final semester at USC.
Okay.
John was the professor of a multicultural cinema course where we specifically talked about race and representation from the beginning of cinema through present day, watching movies that were even produced by Golden Harvest, watching movies that were shot in France, all of that to sort of get an idea of what minority representation means today and how sort of the same narrative is repeated over time. For example, you can look at a classic Western where you're talking about, it's the Americans versus the Indians, the European Americans versus the Indians. Well, the same thing would happen in a movie like Birth of a Nation, the original one, which is, white Americans against the quote-unquote represented savage blacks in that film. And so it's always talking about the other in the narrative. Even for a while, we saw in the 90s lots of narratives about sort of evil Chinese businessmen.
Right.
And luckily it's changed lately. And so I think finally having a voice is really nice in that respect. In terms of finding business partners, I think a lot of the process for me, especially working in television and working on a lot of different sets, is to see the type of people that, one, that I would like to work with, and two, the people that I would like to become like. I had the opportunity to work with many producers in Hollywood, and so it's nice to see how the leadership is changing over the generations. And even in television and film, they're often looking for younger artists, younger filmmakers to put a fresh perspective in film and TV, especially with, the whole diversity movement and the Me Too movement. I think it's very important to give those new voices a chance, because I think, we see so many recreations of old TV shows, and I think it's time that we can see something fresh.
So would you say that USC, obviously John Singleton was your professor, that was a huge boost to you getting that job with Snowfall?
It was a huge boost. I think, I was lucky at USC. I had some really great mentors there. I was even consulting for Disney Imagineering while I was at SC on the Disney parks. And then, but working with John, we had been writing some projects together, and then he just happened to have a window of time that he needed someone to join him on a TV show in New York for Billions, and that's how we connected. But in terms of a lot of my other classmates, I've seen, many of them are very, very talented, but I'm hoping that more of us can find a way into the studio system, studio system is still trying to find a way to fit people in, and it's usually through people In some ways, actually, in Chinese cinema, it's very similar. It's always about the person and you have to get introduced through the individuals through that process. Yeah.
Well, speaking of Chinese individuals, would you have any suggestions on how the listeners find, for example, a Chinese producer, or maybe even an American producer who's interested in the China Hollywood space?
Yeah, so, I've actually had several different meetings with, Chinese production companies, including the equivalent of ABC over there, which was one of the production companies that was representing an entire district in China. And so I think finding a good producer is one to see if someone who has worked overseas before. And one of the things I recommend is oftentimes to look into Hong Kong, because those producers had specifically worked with, two different systems, that they're able to maneuver through many different languages and culture. And in fact, for a lot of entry-level filmmakers, I would recommend that if they are looking to do deals in China that they might want to make it more comfortable for themselves, they can also do deals in Hong Kong, because tentatively for now, the legal agreements follow the Hong Kong law system.
Right.
Which, because a lot of us are trying to enter the Chinese film market. And I think since China is still really developing in how they are creating content, there's just different entryways and learning curves for each of the markets.
That's good advice. But just a side question. If you, for example, wanted to qualify as a Chinese co-production, and I've heard different answers from different Chinese producers and different American producers. If you go with a mainland Chinese production company or a Hong Kong production company or a Hong Kong star, is that considered part of the Chinese co-production, or is it considered almost like a foreign entity?
So from what I understand, because I actually have been traveling back and forth between China to better understand the system, if you wanted, there's no official co-production title. It's really a Chinese production that ends up distributed into other markets.
Okay.
That's from what I understand. I might be incorrect. And so if you are able to start your production company in Hong Kong or even Guangzhou, as long as you go through the quotas, not only the censorship bureau sort of vet it within the system, make sure it's appealing to the potential Chinese market with the script, and then you go through the production, and then you show the completed product to them. You can work through that system, and then you can bypass what we call that quota. It's much more difficult if you are competing with the big Hollywood studios and trying to fit with that small number of projects. So like, for example, in Guangzhou, there's a lot of young startup production companies, and I recommend new filmmakers to go meet some of these production companies, because I think they're looking for really great talent out there. And also through our U.S. Embassy, they're able to help introduce people to you that have potentially worked with our embassy or had some sort of connection to them. So I think
that's a good
point.
tip. That's a very good tip. Now, this next question is about perhaps an obstacle. Can you talk a little bit about an obstacle you encountered on a past project, and how did you overcome it, and what did you learn?
Yeah, so on my first major short film, which was called Lil Tokyo Reporter, it was a 30-minute short that was very, very ambitious. It was a 1930s period piece set in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, with Academy Award-winning lead actor. It was difficult for a lot of people to trust that I would be able to actually finish the production and to direct it well. And oftentimes for young filmmakers, you will be called or considered young and ambitious. But what I always had to remind myself is that one day I won't be young, and then I'll just be ambitious. So what difference does it make, right? And how are we supposed to, get better in our craft without actually doing it?
Right.
And so I was very lucky to have some really good mentors to step up and be like, hey, you have to trust this young filmmaker because the proof is going to be in the pudding. And if he doesn't do it, someone else is going to do it, maybe even not with the grounded perspective of representation. And so that was one of the encounters I had, and that was probably about maybe even a year of vetting for me to get to that place that, finally we were able to get it made properly. And then another obstacle, of course, finding ways to get financing.
Right.
Short films, of course, you can always go for donations, and that's easy because then you don't have to worry about what the investors need back. And then obviously there's a lot of wonderful grant money, and if you get a fiscal sponsor, say from an organization like Visual Communications, who is our fiscal sponsor in Lil Tokyo Reporter, you're able to gather lots and lots of donations where people can get a tax-deductible write-off and also apply to grants. For feature films, I'm learning more and more about government funds and sort of the tax benefits in the different areas. And so when you look at that, you got to be very careful because sometimes you might be having to bring your crew to an isolated place in the country where you're going to have to fly everyone over there, house them, and that tax benefit might not really work out. And so just finding people, like you said, to meet people who have experienced that certain territory that you want to film in and sort of vet it that way. In fact, one of the top liaisons that I've been working with lately is a company called Salon Media. And Salon Media was founded by T.C. Wong and Ray Stark, both USC alumni. And they had produced World of Susie Wong and Enter the Dragon. And those were some of the first co-productions between U.S. and China.
Right.
And it fell under that category it worked out because Hong Kong was actually still a UK territory. So they were able to take funds from the UK to fund a production and send it to sort of work as co-production between China and Hong Kong during that time. The son of T.C. Wong, Fred Wong, is in Hong Kong, who is also a USC alum, and he has offices all across China, and he's just been so gracious and so generous with his time to help introduce me to people that, he has vetted personally, since he's sort of the godfather on that side of Hong Kong cinema. Yeah.
Wow, that's an excellent resource.
Yeah.
And so did you met him through your USC network?
Yeah, so I was introduced to him by the head of our Hong Kong Alumni Association, Garrick Tang. Okay. And he's always just been so warm and welcoming to me. And, I think it's a great resource to find a way through maybe your alumni network to help branch out and then work with hopefully our local institutions like our embassies to help vet the proper team. Because, in any business, people are always looking to make money, but you also have to protect the interest of those financiers and also your interest in actually getting the project made. Because I've heard many stories, in America and, anywhere across the globe, but also including China, where financiers have pulled the funds and because the money wasn't in a proper escrow fund.
Wow.
And it has become a big challenge because you get the money pulled right before you go into production, and you can't pay back your investors because you don't have money to finish the film.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
That sort of leads me to my next question. If you could magically solve two of your current problems, what would they be?
One thing that I've been realizing more and more lately is that, well, you saw Black Panther, right?
Of course.
And so the theme of Wakanda is more than just a place or homeland for sort of the African narrative or African American narrative. It's actually Wakanda represents everyone within each community that has gained some sort of wealth financially or socially that is able to give back, if that makes any sense. So now we're in a point that Asia has a significant amount of wealth, probably the most amount of wealth that I've seen in my generation. I'm 31 right now. And they have an opportunity to actually start supporting stories of Asian diaspora. And I think that's something that I would really like to see, that we don't always have to pay homage to, Western traditions of representation, but to really start celebrating the unique stories that we have of minorities across the globe. Because I think that will help us better understand cultures, the nuances of it all. And specifically, I've been doing a lot of work with our U.S. embassies. I did a talk in Beijing, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen to encourage young filmmakers, both locally in China and outside of China, to start documenting their family's history so that one day you can tell the stories that need to be told. So that's an issue that I hope that would be solved, which is, trust in our representation of our communities across the globe and give us a chance to make a film. We don't need to make another action movie that emulates Hollywood. Let's make something culturally authentic to China, because for a country with such a long-standing traditions of millennia, how come we haven't been able to really bring those movies across the globe in a way that is really meaningful? And so that's what I'm hopeful for. And then maybe you can pose another question or problem to me.
What? Okay. Well, how would you get those Chinese films? I assume you're talking about a Chinese domestic film. How would you get those across the globe, since they haven't exported so commercially before?
I think it's just about taking a chance. I think I've seen a lot of projects that have been emulating the Hong Kong tradition of cinema and with the traditional ways of comedy, which is, usually slapstick, and the thing is, Chinese audiences have been exposed to so much more content in this generation that they have been able to get a refined understanding of cinema in their own perspective. And so sometimes it is playing more of the dramas or, action movies that take place in different places but stars Chinese actors, to give a sense of, identity and relatability across the globe. So, maybe it might be a story about a Chinese guy growing up in Africa, because his family was involved in one of the construction businesses, and him finding his identity by relating to the local community there. Or specifically talking about, the Chinese representation in Ireland, which is like, you look at America, you see that Chinese immigrants and Irish immigrants were treated very similarly.
That's right.
And our communities are so similar. And of course, we also enjoy the same type of beverages. And so, or at least for me. And so, I think there's a lot of really great and fun stories that we can tell. And it's about going for a broader scope that allows cinema to be cinema. We don't go to movies to go watch people sit in a room unless it's, a specific, if it's a horror film, genre film, whatever. But we would go to movies to see an experience. I've talked to many local Chinese, and they say, they don't like to always watch dramas because they're working, and it's sometimes hard to watch a sad drama unless it's like a soap opera.
Right.
And so we got to get a feeling of those sort of nuances that people need and are looking for. Yeah.
And do you think to get those Chinese movies across the globe that they need to shoot in English? I'm just curious.
I don't think so. I mean, we just had, what was the Narcos? Most of that show's in Spanish.
Oh, right, right.
And we're talking about, like, you look at South America, huge Asian population who could maybe even understand Mandarin, Canada, UK, of course. There's people all over the globe, and I think introducing people to another language also allows them to appreciate the nuances of it. You're looking at, like, how French film, affected cinema so much. And it was just about people appreciating the eloquence of a language that they, maybe relayed to something romantic, right? And so what does Chinese represent in that scope? And I just saw Tomb Raider, and what I was impressed with was they actually used Cantonese throughout it whenever they used Daniel Wu's character.
Okay.
And I know a lot of modern trends has been to use Mandarin, but now I think China is also going to celebrate sort of the different cultures within the larger scope of China, which is, it's a huge country.
That's a good point. Now, speaking of films or film or TV, what sort of future projects are you either looking for or hoping to make? And that, what kind of, is it film or TV? What kind of genre? And what do you think the Chinese studios might be looking to make?
Well, for me, I'm currently focusing on knocking out this one feature that deals with Japanese immigration to Los Angeles and a couple civil rights leaders involved in that journey. And so that's a project a long time coming, and I'm about to publish a biography on this individual named Seifuji. And so that project, for the scope of it, will take mostly place in Los Angeles, also maybe potentially Japan. And as for the China market, I'm actually interested in trying to tell stories of overseas Chinese. So not just like what the stereotypical of the San Francisco Chinatown or whatever, because I know that we have 2 Tong Wars series coming up. We have one by Wong Kar-wai on Amazon and then another by Justin Lin on Cinemax. But, really get into the nitty-gritty of the community and how they've been represented over time. I'm really curious about New York Chinatown, UK Chinatown, and especially places where we wouldn't expect to see Chinese. And then some of my friends are actually prepping me to go shoot a pilot sometime in the summer that might take place in Hong Kong, which is about a youth. It's a youth narrative of kids exploring across China. Yeah.
And then, as far as the Chinese market, what do you think? Can you elaborate on that a little bit? On what they're looking for?
Chinese market, I think, is right now it's ripe to find their own unique voice. I've heard that even from investors that some of the top actors in China that we might be familiar with in the West are not putting people into seats. And a lot of times they're focusing on these young singers that can bring audiences to the theaters. And so I think the Chinese market right now should try to explore deeper dramas that, people in the Western world can appreciate, not just, people living within China. But of course, I've seen wonderful pieces like a Beijing adaptation of Bicycle Thief. But I'd really like to see what it means for Chinese to come to United States, South America, and see how they react to those spaces. Because as audience members, we have these urges to travel, to explore and see things, and I think we'll be able to relate to the protagonists better that way. So for Chinese market, I also think that that's something that they're looking for. Many of our colleagues at USC, I think a huge percentage of them were Chinese immigrants from both China and Taiwanese immigrants from Taiwan. And, there's a lot of Chinese people who get educated in, United States and UK, and those voices need to be heard. And a lot of their families could relate to it because, how often do you hear from your own child when they go off to college or go off, on their own? And it can help people relate to it and be like, I had that experience, Even Australia, you've heard of all those hardships of the kids being mistreated, even though, Australia should be such a, liberal country. And so I think it's those voices are, right now is the time to tell those stories. And I think the investors will do very well by showing those stories.
Have you, speaking of investors, have you approached any, or have they given you any feedback as far as what they would like to make? I know you have this idea of the Chinese, overseas Chinese experience, but what have investors or the Chinese studios told you that they might be interested in investing in?
So I did have a meeting with one of the top production companies, and they were interested in just investing in standard Hollywood productions.
Okay.
And I understand it from a finance sense. They know that it makes money, right? So if you make the next Mission Impossible, you're going to make money. But another part of that is, and one of the legs of that company was about cultural preservation. And I think that a lot of these companies should look at, not just what's preservation of the Silk Road or artifacts that had been taken from China, but talk about preservation of our representation. Because, even from a political standpoint, you look at how Chinese products were thought as, cheap, or the technology was stolen from Western, inventions. But if you look at the longstanding heritage of Chinese, some of the best inventions came from China, and they were shared around the world. The compass, the rudder, paper, fiber optics were refined by Chinese inventors. And so you can look at it and see, hey, this world is becoming a world economy. It's no longer one country controls everything. I think it's time that, even as people, we're able to work with people across the globe. And so I can see that happening. Maybe I went off the point.
No. I think if you could come up with a script that it kind of combines those points of view, that might be interesting. I mean, not everybody can make Mission Impossible 6 for whatever budget it is, 100, 200 million, who knows. Better to go for the lower budget, culturally preserving idea that you mentioned.
Well, if you look at a movie like Thurgood, the one that was directed by Reg Hedlund, this past year, I think 5 or 6 of the producers were Chinese. Mm. And so you can see that investors were actively looking in, participating in what they thought was American cinema, and which it is American cinema, but it wasn't like an action film or whatever. So I think Chinese investors can look and see if they can sort of build up some more of the Asian American talent here. And I think it will give us all a good chance to start expanding our voices and allow us to build in a better place into the studio system.
What was the name of that movie? I didn't quite hear you.
Thurgood, the one based on Thurgood Marshall.
Oh, yes. Okay.
With Chadwick Boseman.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now this next question is sort of a trick question. What question did I not ask you that I should have?
I think you're going to ask me if I could do anything over in my career. What would I do differently?
Well, we could.
Or which question?
Well, we can let's ask that. That one. Would you do anything differently in your career if you had the chance?
I don't think I would do much differently. I've learned so much through this process. I do know, if I recommended kids who get into SC film school, that if they can go to film school in undergrad, especially like SC, UCLA, NYU, AFI, they should jump straight into the industry. I, for me, went to UC Berkeley for my undergrad, which was one of the best learning experiences I had because we studied a lot of film theory, so I got to understand film language. But definitely if I had gone to SC for undergrad, I would have jumped straight into producing more and more films. And then, of course, as any artist, we would always look back 15 years ago and be like, hey, if I knew what I knew now, I would be able to direct even better than I thought. But, that's just part of the process.
So you're saying you made all those great connections at USC, so you still would have needed that MFA anyway.
Yeah, I think that SC is the network, the family, the mafia, as we call it,
It's a good mafia.
It's a really strong family, and I think it makes a difference. I know that I had some friends go to the school from across the town, UCLA, and
you can mention their name.
and then they're having a harder time to find job opportunities.
Really?
So
Interesting.
one of the things that I've been trying to do is include my friends as much as I can on this journey, because at the end of the day, this older generation is going to phase out, and it's going to be us running the world of cinema, and we gotta have our friends with us, and also look out for other people. And I think being genuine and being nice to people is so vitally important, and people pick up on that. So
of course. Now you sort of already answered one of my questions about what you're trying to accomplish this year. You mentioned the bio and the feature film about the Japanese immigrant. Let me ask a different question. What skills are essential to being effective in your job where, let's say, you are trying to work with Chinese investors or find a Chinese production company? What skills would you need for that?
I think you really have to learn Chinese.
Okay, and you mean
one
Mandarin.
Of the most important ones. Yeah, Mandarin. I mean, in Hong Kong, sometimes people like to deal in Cantonese, but they'll appreciate if you at least, because they'll speak English too. So if you understand Mandarin, it's great too. But I think it's so important because it makes people feel comfortable with you. Okay. And my Mandarin's not even that fluent. Like I had to go up to Beijing and get a private tutor and all that. And it's a long process, but I think trying to participate in the culture in an intimate level of, not just as a tourist, but as someone who cares to help continue the traditions of the country. Right. I think that's important. And also to, sort of understand who you are connecting with. So to sort of see what the CV of that individual is, which companies they worked for previously. And it's pretty easy to connect to people via WeChat to sort of vet the people that you would like to work with. Also, another organization that I've been working with is the Hong Kong Screen Association. And they're one of the companies that help audit productions that go through China. And they're able to help me do research on who could be a potential great partner to work with and who might be maybe too green for our needs.
Do you need to be Chinese in order for them to help you?
No. They're very welcoming and also great and nice people. Okay. I think
that's a good tip. Hong Kong Screen Association?
Yeah, let me just double check.
I can put it in the show notes. I mean, if you don't have it handy, you can. But definitely, that's a good resource.
Yeah, so they're very wonderful people.
Okay.
Dr. Sam Ho, is the head of the Hong Kong International Screen Association. Yeah. And they're also with the Motion Pictures Association. So
perfect. Now I'm gonna still hit you with my trick question. What question did I not ask you that I should have?
Let's see.
Something maybe. Go ahead.
What would be my dream project in China? I don't know.
Let's hear that. What would be your dream project in China?
So I have a lot of. So one of the most important things growing up to me was Chinese lion dance.
Okay.
You see it during the Chinese New Year's parades. Yep. And for me, it was something that grounded me in my culture. I grew up in Marin County, where I was one of the only Asian kids there. And performing lion dance on a regular basis, finding a community in it, made me feel like I was able to put on a mask, a facade, a symbol that would represent a stronger version of me. And so I'd like to do a story that takes place in like Fatsan, about the traditions and how it has carried over through the generations. So that would be something very close to my heart. Yeah.
Okay, well that's a good question. I mean, I like how you You came up with that. Good. Now, this last question is, what advice can you give those aspiring to tap into the Chinese market?
I'd say head over there. I'd
Okay.
say don't be afraid to cold call people. I've been very good about trying to find companies that I thought I would like to meet and sort of maybe go to their website or go to LinkedIn to see if they'd be open to meet. There's no promises and how anything can happen, but at least getting a meeting can give you an opportunity. I know that we have a lot of groups like the Chinese Hollywood Society, which is good, but I think trying to build those connections on a personal level is very important. I did some business in Beijing, and you might end up in meetings where you think it's going really, really well, and then you go celebrate, and then the next week you might not hear back, and so it's kind of it's a struggle because it's a lot of the producers are still finding the grounding in China, and so it's just a process in it. I've just been really lucky to find really great allies who have worked on productions in China to introduce me to them. So I'd say, visit China for yourself, look at companies that you really respect and try to see what they've been up to lately and see if you're able to meet any of their developing partners. And even you can look at companies like Warner Brothers. They're out in China right now. They have a whole leg of their production company in China.
Right.
So there's ways to do what is comfortable for you. But to be honest, I think the whole Chinese market is going to be changing quite a bit. I mean, now they have Netflix, and the rule used to be, no ghosts or spirits. But you look at the movie Coco, it did exceptionally well in China.
Right.
And most of the movie takes place in the world of the dead.
Yes, right.
And so those things are changing, and I think it's just about trying to find a story that you feel that people would appreciate, and don't take advantage of the culture in the way that in our Western culture we've been sort of used to. The Big Trouble in Little China sort of representation, things like that. We got to just find a way to make authentic characters within the worlds.
Good point. Now, Jeffrey, in conclusion, would you like to share any social media details or any website links?
So you can go to my LinkedIn, which is, I think it's @TheLeapMan, and that's my Twitter and Instagram. So let's see. LinkedIn is Leapman, so no E, so LEAPMAN. And then Twitter is The Leapman, TheLeapman, and also Instagram.
Great. Okay, I'll put those all in the show notes. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for all this information, these great resources. This is going to be very helpful to our audience. And I just want to say thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, actually, I'll tell you a few quick things that I'm doing this year. So, I'm going to be spending about a month in Japan doing research and refining my current screenplay. I will also be publishing that biography, the book.
Great.
I also plan to do a couple shorts and potentially a commercial this year. The long-term goal is obviously that I want to help build a feature-length production company and eventually branch out to television to tell the more intimate stories that we do have as Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, and that could be, whether it's period piece or not, I think it's time to bring these stories out. So I'm so grateful that you took the time to interview me today.
My pleasure, Jeffrey. We actually tell the audience that it was the U.S. consulate, U.S. commercial service in Hong Kong that introduced us. So yes, and thank you again for mentioning the U.S. Embassy as a resource. So very good.
Shout out to Jericho.
Yeah,
Lee.
Hey Jericho. Thank you, Jericho Lee. Okay, Jeffrey. Well, thank you again for coming on the show today.
Okay, thank you.
And we'll see you at the premiere.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
I have 3 key points. Number 1, now is the time. As Jeffrey said, the old guard of film and TV are changing, and they are looking for younger artists, filmmakers with a fresh perspective. This whole diversity movement and Me Too movement has opened doors, and so now is the time for new voices. Number 2, school alumni. Jeffrey got a huge head start on his career by having the acclaimed director John Singleton as one of his USC professors. As you've heard before on this podcast, you've got to mine those alumni networks. People want to work with people they know, who they have a history with. So go to your next alumni function. And that includes me too. So number 3, Hong Kong versus Mainland Chinese producers. Jeffrey suggests you go to Hong Kong or Guangzhou to find producing partners. Currently, Hong Kong's legal agreements follow the Hong Kong system, not the Mainland Chinese legal system. Jeffrey highlighted there's a lot of startup film companies in Guangzhou, so put them on your radar and get on theirs. Now for takeaways, I've got several. Today I've got 6. And the first one, number 1, overseas Chinese. Jeffrey said he's keen to tell stories of overseas Chinese. For example, a Chinese person growing up in Africa or Ireland. This could be a spark of an idea for writers out there who are looking to shoot with the China market in mind, but also take advantage of overseas tax breaks. And it's a fresh idea. Hey, Chinese in Africa did great for Wolf Warrior 2. And as Jeffrey said, we all have an urge to travel and explore things. So make your protagonist a fish out of water, those are my words, in a foreign country. And according to Jeffrey, this is appealing to Chinese investors. Number 2, singers over actors. Jeffrey said that some, quote, A-list Chinese actors are not attracting fans into movie theaters. And now Chinese investors are going after young singers. So if you are casting, remember, A-list stars are expensive and booked, usually on simultaneous projects for years. So consider casting a singer. Number 3, preserve cultural heritage. Jeffrey brought up the fact that besides Chinese studios wanting a piece of the next Hollywood blockbuster, there is a desire to preserve their cultural heritage or invest in projects that do that for other cultures. Jeffrey mentioned there were several Chinese producers on the film Marshall, which is the story of Thurgood Marshall, the crusading lawyer who would become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Number 4, film school. Jeffrey said if he had to do it over again, he'd probably go to USC undergrad and then go straight into the job market instead of getting a master's in film. Number 5, learn Mandarin, or at least some sentences, some words. Jeffrey said a big skill in finding a Chinese producing partner is the ability to speak Mandarin. Now, even Jeffrey said he isn't fluent, and nobody expects a Guilo. I mean, this is my words. Nobody expects a Guilo to spend 5 years away from their job to learn a new language. But if you show you want to participate in the culture, that can only impress and develop guanxi with your potential partners. Number 6, partners. Jeffrey mentioned the Hong Kong International Screen Association as a resource to find potential partners. Now, I contacted them last week, and alas, they told me they don't do that. However, I think I used the wrong words. I asked them if they could introduce me to potential partners, and I should have said, as Jeffrey did, help research potential partners. So anyway, I'm going to try again and see what happens. So that's the show for this week. Thanks for listening. Don't forget, leave a review on iTunes and help other people find the podcast. And I'll see you at the premiere. Bye. 一会儿见.